So hi, and thanks for the invite. And what I'd like to do for the next 20 minutes is put a bow tie on a lot of the things you've heard this morning by really looking at three trends, but putting a 2018 lens on those trends. And if we do this right, I hope to come out the other side of that with some epiphanies about what we really need in terms of a platform going forward that will help us or help our business in this era of sustained business acceleration. So let's start. Let's unpack these things, right? The first trend I want to talk about, something you probably noticed that started back in 2010, was this, right? All of a sudden, we had mobile phones, smartphones, we had cellular broadband access, and we had app stores, so we could download any app we wanted. And what it did is it gave us power as customers, right? We had a voice through social. And it also represented an enormous shift in business strategy, something Forrester calls the age of the customer. And essentially what happened is companies realized that to survive, they had to become customer obsessed, which means they had to understand customers, provide the information they want, provide the service they want, or those customers would go elsewhere. And this also had a secondary effect, because essentially what happened is big data became important because customers were telling us all kinds of information about themselves by their behaviors, and now it was up to businesses to make sense of that, right? So we've seen this play out, and we're still in the age of the customer. Second trend has to do with what happened when we began to study big data. So at Forrester, we've been following how firms are dealing with big data for many years. And one of the things we noticed is there were certain firms that were doing things different. They were clobbering their competition with big data. And the way they were doing it is they were actually designing business models where insights, knowing things their competitors didn't, were baked into software that worked in closed loops to drive competitive advantage. And we call these firms insight-driven firms. And one of the things they were doing is they were building systems of insight where they could continuously test, measure, experiment, learn, and adapt faster than their competitors in the market. So we studied these firms, and we looked at, like, how are they growing? And one of the things we noticed once we began to identify these firms, that they were growing about 30% annually. Big public companies as well as small startups, as you can see. Whereas GDP was growing at about 3.5%, which means that these insight-driven firms were growing simply because they were taking customers from firms that weren't insight-driven. Right? So second trend. Third trend. I want to point out, exponential is still happening, right? It's really easy to think, well, Moore's law's petered out, we're reaching the limits of physics, right? But now we have this thing, Metcalfe's law, right? Which has been around for a while. It's about the power of networks. Well, it's interesting that Metcalfe himself only proved that law in 2013 when he had access to social network data from Facebook. And now Jeff Bezos, I think back in 2014, supposedly said something about the cost of cloud computing being cut in half every 3 years. So Bezos is a lot. We're just getting started with that, and we really don't know. We haven't measured that enough to know if that's true. But my point is these exponential trends are happening right in front of our eyes. So I want to think for a moment about what the impact of these exponential trends are. And we've talked a lot about these things this morning. So first off, there's a dramatic reduction in the cost of understanding the world. Storing data is cheaper than ever. Analyzing data is cheaper than ever. I've just noticed this over the time I've been covering big data, how much cheaper and faster things have gotten in 5, 6, 7 years. But also things like Bezos' law mean that the cost of software innovation is going to zero, right? We know that too, right? You can fake it till you make it. The cost of failure is low. And what this means is the pace of business change is increasing. And you've seen this chart before probably. It's from a firm called InnoInsights that plots the 7-year average firms are spending on the S&P 500. Back in the 1970s, it was around 30 years. We project in 2025, it's going to be around 12, right? So a rapid increase in the pace of disruption and business acceleration. So not wanting just to leave it there, I did a survey recently of about 30 CIOs and VP level executives, and I asked them, is the pace of business now faster than it was 5 years ago? This is what they said. Their words, not mine. What was funny though, is as I was thinking about this study, I said, well, if I asked this same question 5 years ago, I would have got the exact same answer. And then it hit me. Something really hit me. And that's what I want you to understand about 2018. How many people remember, mostly guys, fast car, you're in your 20s or you just got your driver's license, and it's the first time you were behind a car with a really big engine, and you're like on a straightaway and you're like, let's see what this baby can do, and you hit the accelerator and you started moving, right? Remember that? I remember it. Those of you who have Teslas probably do that every day, right? But at some point, it was cool because you were going slow, picking up speed, and you felt the acceleration, and it was exciting. But at some point, if you left your foot on the gas, you realized that you had exceeded the speed limit and you're going dangerously breakneck fast. Holy moly, I got to do something. And what I would say to you is that's where we are today in 2018. Because not only is business accelerating and moving fast, we have a long-term record of sustained acceleration that means that we are moving at breakneck speed. So here's the problem with breakneck speed. There's this idea in the industry, it's baked into our very bones, as it were, that tells us to wait for the bleeding edge to bleed, right? Crossing the chasm, late majority, early majority, hype cycle, all those things almost say it's okay to wait to jump in, right? And that is essentially a drafting strategy. Now, what's the problem with a drafting strategy when the guy in front of you can accelerate faster than you? Doesn't work. And that's the problem. That is the problem. You see, today when we look at our data at Forrester and we talk to thousands of enterprises, all of them have their change engines blasting. Big money's being spent in digital transformation, hundreds of millions, even in some cases billions of dollars, to reinvent themselves, to reinvent customer experiences, to reinvent their digital capabilities. That represents a blasting change engine, and in many cases, what's underneath that is a platform that cannot sustain the acceleration. And so what I want to do here is spend the second half of my talk really talking about how you can recognize where we are today and adapt how you're investing in that platform to create a platform that can sustain your business through this phase of continuous acceleration that we find ourselves in. And I want to talk about three different things, three different tweaks. These are not completely new, but what I want to do, my hope is that when you walk out of here and you take the break, that I've changed the way you think about things just enough, just a little, so you can start to ask some different questions, which get you different answers, and you make different decisions, and you get different results. So the three things you need to remember are this. Number one, you need to add the edge to your thinking. Number two, you need to shift from DevOps to no-ops. And number three, you need to take your data lake and evolve it into a data fabric. So let's unpack each one of these for a few minutes. First, adding the edge. What I'm here to tell you, and you already sense this, is that the new frontier for big data analytics is in the piles of data that are accumulating in co-location centers, in plants, in homes, in automobiles, that will never go into the cloud, never go into your data center simply because you don't have the bandwidth and it's too expensive and you're not sure what you're going to do with that data. As you think about what you're going to do with that, I will tell you that we see leaders building these closed-loop systems of insight where components of those systems don't live in the cloud, they live out on the edge where the data is. And this is a very different distributed kind of architecture, very different. It requires you to make some different design decisions. So let me give you some examples. One decision that you have to make is how your system will be controlled. So for instance, a traffic control system, a transportation control system, kind of works very well in a hierarchical structure, which is something most of us who've been building control systems understand. But if you're designing a system to help autonomous vehicles avoid each other, a traffic system, that's a peer-to-peer system. Each node in the network, each thing needs to be a lot smarter. Different design. Another example. Consider the boundaries of your system. So if you're designing a smart store, everything in that store that you can control is the boundary, and nothing else comes in, so it's fairly straightforward. Now, consider the fact that you bring your customers in who have different mobile platforms, different applications, maybe devices. That becomes an unbounded system. Again, it has to be a lot more intelligent. It has to be a lot smarter. And each one of these decisions, and there's several more of these I don't have time to go through from our research, each one of these creates a set of design decisions. Where do I keep my data? Where do the analytics happen? How do I manage and distribute those analytics? What are the protocols? How is insight shared? What has to be smart? How smart does it have to be? So these are different decisions. And so you have to start thinking about things like Hortonworks Minify. You have to start thinking about how you take containers, right, and distribute them out to the edge and manage and govern the analytics that are happening there. Different thoughts, different parameters, different designs. Secondly, shift from DevOps to NoOps. And what I'm talking about there is, if you think about Hadoop, Hadoop was the ultimate DevOps tool, wasn't it? Because the people who operated it were the only people who understood it, many of you in this room, and therefore you had to operate it as well. It was the ultimate DevOps tool, and as a result, Hadoop and perhaps Spark clusters had many different knobs and levers that you could fine-tune those clusters to do exactly what you wanted them to do. Now, what started to happen as these clusters landed in the enterprise is that enterprises realized these things aren't so easy to scale. They can be hard. And so that's why we saw in 2015 a massive shift to the cloud. And as enterprises moved into the cloud, we started to see things like where the cloud vendors were taking advantage of those exponential trends to undermine the need to have all those knobs and dials on the clusters. And they started to create things like serverless and highly managed services. So for instance, one client built a data warehouse as a service on Azure, didn't build it, they just bought it, purchased it with a credit card, took about 4 DBAs, repurposed them from managing the warehouse to doing project work. Another manufacturing client I spoke to built an AWS Athena interactive SQL capability to look at call center notes with no operations at all. They did that in about a week. As opposed to another manufacturing client was trying to do something similar, it had to recode and retest Spark jobs, and it was going to take them a month or more to do, right? And lastly, consider Google's cloud platform, where their data flow tool is a distributed, high availability, serverless data orchestration tool capable of both streaming and batch data workloads without ops. So recognize that I'm not talking about serverless so much as I'm talking about a general shift as capabilities mature from having to develop it and operate it to just developing. And this idea right now, while it's mostly in the cloud vendor world, it's too good of an idea to stay there. I think every vendor is going to be looking at how they can make things more a no-ops platform to allow you to spend your time delivering value and less time having to control all the underlying infrastructure. And lastly, evolving from a data lake to a data fabric. We've seen this, and I've tracked it for many years. In fact, I wrote about data lakes back in 2013, I think. And they were a great idea at the time. The problem with data lakes is they operate on this batch ELT kind of framework where everything goes into the lake and then you do stuff with it. And what we're seeing is as firms begin to address the closing gap between data and required action, expand out to the edge, as they're realizing that that really stresses the data lake architecture. And so we talk at Forrester a lot about a data fabric architecture. And what is a fabric? So a fabric does a couple of things. First off, it allows us to store data in many different places based on our needs and the kind of data that it is. And it allows us to separate that data storage from compute, from the analytics. Right? Hadoop was the major breakthrough of bringing the analytics to the data. Now the next evolution and what the cloud vendors are allowing is separation of those things with something in the middle. So everyone kind of understands that, and that's why cloud has been so popular. But what goes in the middle? The first thing I think that goes in the middle is you have to then, what we talked about, you have to bring in the edge. You have to connect to everything that's going on outside the cloud and data center at some level so you can begin to think about managing what's there. So not only do you have Hortonworks and its data flow product addressing that, you have many other vendors, all the cloud vendors, all the major IoT and hardware vendors are all building some form of embed a small piece of code in a device, and that will let you understand the data that device is producing and begin to think about managing it. So you need to first bring the edge into your fabric architecture. Second, and even more importantly, and we heard about this from Praveen, but I want to say just a quick word about it, you need a unifying set of services that revolve around metadata, security, and governance. If you don't have those three things, and I'll tell you things like Apache Atlas and Ranger are doing a fairly good job unifying what we at Forrester refer to as the Hadoop and Friends ecosystem. But what needs to happen is we need to bring into that unifying framework data flow schema registries and things like Kafka registries. It needs to all be brought together so that you have a technology hope of unifying metadata security and governance for all of your data. And once that technology barrier is down, I think firms will begin to address some of the cultural issues that they have. Because we all know it's harder culturally than it is from a technology perspective. But today it's very early days, even in that technology. So we need a shared set of services to do that. And I think those services need to be open source, personally. They need to be open source because of the scale at which these things are going to operate. So what goes in the middle? Well, not only do you need batch data orchestration tools, which you have, tools like Pentaho and Talend and some of the open source tools that you get, but then you need to layer on top of those two things. You need real-time streaming data flow in cloud and on-premise to connect out to the edge through gateways. And you also need a tight integration with some kind of a distributed messaging service like Apache Kafka or Google PubSub or MQ, RabbitMQ, I guess, right? So once you begin to unify all these things together, the architecture no longer looks like a data lake. It looks like a data pipeline where you can have many data lakes. You can have as many as you want in multiple cloud vendors, right? With this unifying data pipeline that brings it all together in what we think of as a fabric architecture. So that's the third thing that I think you need. Third thing you need. So let's take just a moment in closing and kind of go back to the beginning and think about where we started. So the first thing we recognize is there are some trends that were still progressing that have begun to come to a head in 2018, and we talked about the important new is the fact that not only are we accelerating, we've been accelerating long enough that 2018 is that critical year where you raise your head up and you go, man, things are moving fast and it's almost dangerous for us. And it's dangerous for you because if you don't understand and make the right technology choices going forward, you could get left behind when you step on the accelerator and your engine sputters out. So then we talked about three things to help you build that platform for sustained business innovation. Now, what have not we talked about? You're probably curious as I walked up on stage, I call this Welcome to the Bronze Age of Big Data. Why did I do that? Well, the answer has to do with a fellow by the name of Ray Kurzweil. Heard of him, works for Singularity University, used to be a Googler, one of the world's leading experts on these exponential trends. And Ray wrote a paper in 2001 called The Law of Accelerating Returns. And in that paper, he talked about what happens when one technology builds on another and accelerates the returns. And you can see that. First there was Hadoop, then there was Spark, now there's machine learning, and AI, and on and on and on. Those things have happened, and they're not going to stop. Well, one of the things he said in exponential systems is that what you get is Moore's law like curves. In fact, he said that Moore's law is not the exception, rather we should expect Moore's law to be the rule. So as we think about all these Moore's law-like things that we're seeing, he also said that because of this pace of acceleration, he expected in the next 100 years to experience something like 20,000 years of human evolution because of the doubling of things. Now, believe that or not, I took that with a grain of salt, but at the end of the day, you can really kind of see it happening in front of our very eyes at just the pace at which things are going and doubling, right? And so what I'm here to say is, where were we 20,000 years ago? 20,000 years ago, we were in the Stone Age. And I think as we take this moment here and understand what we have to do to get our architecture to the next level, it will move us into the Bronze Age of big data. One of the things that I've noticed, having covered big data for a number of years now, is interest in that term has kind of petered off and waned. And I think that's a shame, because if you think about the things that are going on and this sustained business acceleration environment that we're in, I think we are absolutely just getting started. So thank you very much. Enjoy your break. I'm going to turn it back over to our host. Thank you.